A recent estimate suggests that there are 1 billion dogs in the world today. That's roughly 1 dog for every 7 people. And to my knowledge, there is no current society in which dogs are entirely absent. And so my question is why? Why do people all over the world have dogs? As anthropologists, we imagine that dogs must provide some tangible value. What is that value? Now, for troublemaking dogs, house dogs here in the United States, we make an exception. Most anthropologists have concluded that dogs are largely a drain on household resources, that they might scare away burglars, but just from an economic perspective, it looks maladaptive. That dogs are not providing much value, and that's okay. We have money to spare. We can afford the luxury of keeping dogs. But is that the case in small-scale societies? Poor people, struggling to maintain an adequate supply of food. Can these people afford to keep dogs if they're not bringing something to the table, so to speak? Around the world, there are lots of ways in which dogs can provide tangible value. Conventional activities such as guarding flocks or pulling us around, pulling other things around, and a whole host of new ways, new uses that we have found for dogs just in the last few decades. But why were dogs domesticated in the first place? Before there were flocks to guard and little other apparent use for dogs, why did people start caring for dogs? Was hunting the impetus? That hypothesis has been advanced several times by anthropologists, including Stanley Olson, the author of the book that you see depicted here. The argument is that people capitalize on dogs' complementary hunting abilities, and that the increased amount of harvested meat that they help to provide justifies keeping the dogs around and feeding them. In other words, the assumption is that dogs are earning their keep. And my presentation today looks closely at that assumption. Now, when dogs were first domesticated, all people lived as hunter-gatherers. And although it's not clear that dogs were useful for hunting right away, 15,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, we don't know. Archaeologist Angela Perry has recently documented that in Japan, several thousand years ago, Japanese hunter-gatherers buried their dogs very intentionally, like the grave that you see here, sometimes with grave goods, which indicates to anthropologists that these dogs were highly valued, that they were esteemed for what they were providing as hunting companions. And among modern hunter-gatherers in the Central African Republic, archaeologist Karen Lupo has recently documented that dogs help to harvest large rodents. The point here is that dogs can be useful as hunting companions in hunter-gatherer societies, and maybe that's a key part of the story of dogs in prehistory. Back, excuse me. On the other hand, dogs are not universally valuable as hunting companions in hunter-gatherer societies. In 3 modern hunter-gatherer societies, 2 in Africa, 1 in South America, anthropological researchers have studied them at length, and they find that dogs play a very minimal role as hunting companions. Why would that be? It's puzzling. These societies have had opportunities to acquire and to use hunting dogs, but they choose not to. Is that a smart decision? As an ecological anthropologist, I am trained to view the question of adaptiveness through an economic lens. That is, I weigh the costs and benefits of keeping dogs. And in the case of hunting dogs, we can look at the cost of acquiring dogs and feeding them, providing food for them, versus how much food they're producing as hunting companions. And for dogs to be considered adaptive, these benefits must exceed the cost. Since 2004, I have conducted anthropological research in Nicaragua's Bosawas Reserve, which is home to the Mayangna and Mosquito peoples, indigenous people who have lived in this area with their dogs for centuries. The reserve itself is the core of the second largest tropical rainforest in the Western Hemisphere, with hundreds of bird species and incredible animals like the three-toed sloth and others, and the plant life is equally impressive. The people here, the Mayangna and the mosquitoes, subsist by cultivating rice and bananas and root crops. Hunting and fishing provide valuable sources of protein. And for anthropologists, it is these kinds of settings that provide insight into the challenges that likely characterized prehistoric societies. For example, the people here exhibit evidence of malnutrition. If you look at the growth charts of children, they're stunted. The growth is stunted relative to international standards. And the food that they consume in the household, the food that goes to the dogs comes from the same hearth, right? So that much needed food, in the language of economics, is the cost of giving food to the dogs being repaid by their contributions as hunting companions. The dogs in the reserve do contribute a lot, whereas hunters in other tropical forests often choose to hunt without dogs, relying only on projectile weapons. Here in the reserve, the hunters in Nicaragua bring dogs on more than 80% of the hunting trips. And although dogs aren't much used for hunting birds, they help to capture a number of terrestrial mammals. Approximately 85% of the harvested mammals are captured with the assistance of dogs. In summary, apparently there are few places on Earth where dogs play a more prominent role as hunting companions than they do at my field site here in Nicaragua. One interesting thing, though, is that as important as the dogs are, there's very little training. What you see here in the picture is about as intensive as it gets in terms of training. In this case, the hunter has spotted some tracks and is calling the dog's attention to it. Sort of like, here's some tracks. I'm counting on you to figure out what I want you to know by calling attention to this, that you're supposed to find the animal that left these tracks. The only other noteworthy strategy in terms of training is that sometimes hunters will take a juvenile dog and bring it out with an older dog, hoping that it'll learn from the example. But for the most part, there's very little training, and the people seem to have an essentialist view of hunting dogs, namely that some dogs are born to hunt, and that others simply lack that same innate ability. Now, once a dog learns to hunt, these are some of the animals that it pursues. You have large rodents, such as the paca and the agouti, and the familiar nine-banded armadillo. And there are larger animals, too. Ungulates, such as the red brocket deer and the collared peccary, named for the patch of white fur that adorns their necks. Using observational methods, I followed hunters on approximately 65 or 70 hunting trips, working with a rugged handheld computer to document their behaviors while they hunted. And very early on in my study, it quickly became apparent that I had some profound misconceptions of what to expect when hunting with dogs. You see, I had imagined that the dogs would sort of stay by the hunter's side, until the hunter found some tracks and said, okay, go find the animal. Instead, what happens is you get to the forest, and the hunter immediately sends his dogs out. And the dogs disappear behind the trees into the foliage. The hunter, takes some time to light up a cigarette or sharpen his machete or ask me for the 100th time how my GPS unit works. And it's only when the dogs start to bark that the hunter's work really begins. When the dogs bark, the hunter's listening and trying to figure out what species has the dog found, and where is this chase likely to end up. And then we end up running through the woods, following in, always homing in on the dog's barking. And if all goes well, the dogs have corralled an animal in a burrow or a hollow trunk. And the hunter immediately arrives, not wanting the animal to escape. He'll cut some sticks with a machete, throw it in the possible exits, and then set about the methodical process of getting access to the animal by cutting or digging until he spies it. And then with a machete swipe, dispatches it. A little more effort, you dig it out, you get your animal in hand. Maybe you cut off a little slice of the foot pad to reward the dog for its effort. And then you send your dog out to find more animals. So I'd like to take a moment to say something about barking. Right? Dogs can bark prodigiously for many reasons, but wolves rarely bark. This has led some writers to conclude that barking, in dogs, barking is the product of artificial selection, right? But why would humans select for barking dogs? I've seen books in which authors say that because dogs bark so much, they could not have been useful in hunting, right? That all the barking would just scare away the game. Why would you want a barking dog? And it's true that there are types of hunting in which barking it's not useful. You don't want your dogs to bark. If it's at the end of a leash and you're just using its powerful nose to track the animal, maybe you don't want it to bark. Or if you have a gun dog just waiting to retrieve a target after it falls from the sky, yeah, you don't want the dogs to bark. But where I work, in Nicaragua, absolutely. You want a hound barking its head off. Once it's chased an animal through the woods and is there waiting for you at the burrow, without that barking, the dog would essentially be useless. And I think maybe we need to consider that if we're going to talk about the evolution of barking. Interestingly, the interesting thing for me is that the owners are really good at interpreting their dog's barking as well. So I was out one day helping this man to clear his field. He was going to plant some more corn. And he brought his dogs along. It wasn't a hunting trip, but he was like, well, I'll let them roam around the field, and maybe they'll find something while we work. And the dog's name is Completa. Completa started barking. And the man says to me, he says, I think she has detected an armadillo. And I said, well, are we going to go see? He's like, no, she picked up the scent. When the dog's barking gets a little more high-pitched, that's when we'll know that she's found the burrow. So we work for another 5, 10 minutes. Sure enough, high-pitched barking. He says, okay, let's go. It was uncanny. We walked 2 minutes, caught up with the dog, found an armadillo in its burrow, and that was it. This man exactly knew what was happening. Now, I have said that dogs are the ones responsible for locating the prey. And they do a very good job of it. In my research, for comparative purposes, I compare hunting with dogs to hunting without dogs, just with rifles, for example. And when I go out with rifle hunters, they encounter fewer animals. For example, a hunter walking alone through the forest can expect to see just one agouti in every 24 hours of hunting. But with a dog, you're going to see 9 times that many. Dogs are much better at finding these animals. And the same thing with armadillos. For every one armadillo encountered by a rifle hunter, a hunter with dogs encounters 6 times that many. And do you remember those pacas, the large rodents that I introduced earlier? They are nocturnal animals, sleeping during the day underground. And so a hunter walking through the forest all alone never sees a paca. But with a dog, hunters can expect to encounter one every 5 or 6 hours. The dogs sniff them out in their burrows. And so every 5 or 6 hours, the dogs will bark, and the hunter has a very good chance to pursue a large 10-kilogram, highly coveted animal. So dogs raise encounter rates, and that's a really good thing. But that's not to say that everything about hunting with dogs is better. From the hunter's perspective, it's actually a lot of work. Once you reach the location where the dogs have corralled the animal, it takes a long time to cut your way in or to dig your way in order to get access to that animal. I've seen hunters spend hours in the forest excavating an animal from its burrow like this one. Overall, hunters with dogs spend 30% of their time on a hunting trip actively pursuing an animal. In pursuits like the one you see here. That's 4 times as long as a rifle hunter. And now a rifle hunter gets to spend most of his time walking around looking for the next animal. That's a good thing. And then most of you who have dogs know that dogs don't always do what you want them to do. And I've mentioned that these dogs are not highly trained. And so they waste a lot of time pursuing animals that cannot be caught. They'll chase after almost anything that moves on the ground, including animals such as this tyra, a weasel-like animal that runs fast and far when chased by dogs. It can outrun the dogs all day. One day I was conducting an observation when the dogs chased one of these tyras, and it was more than 45 minutes before the dogs finally came back. The poor hunter was visibly frustrated. He was bellowing. He was like, "Come back, come back." But he was essentially powerless to prevent it. These dogs don't respond to those sorts of calls. The hunters are pretty lucky, right? The tyras are pretty rare. You don't see tyras very often. But if there were one waiting around every tree, then at that point, hunting with dogs would essentially be completely ineffective. And then there are times when dogs track species that the hunters would prefer them not to pursue, like the giant anteater here. This species, the giant anteater, is probably the most endangered animal in all of Central America. But it's not eaten locally by the Mayangnan mosquito. Really, the hunters would be entirely glad if the dogs would just ignore it. Leave it alone. Don't make me come racing 20 minutes through the forest just to find you standing in front of a giant anteater. It's a waste of my time. And so we've seen that dogs have their pros and their cons. Imagine then that you are a Mayangna hunter, and you have to decide if you're going to hunt with dogs or just your rifle. Relative to guns, the advantages of dogs include, as we've seen, an increased encounter rate with certain key species. On the other hand, you'll have those longer pursuits, and every time your dogs chase a tyra, that's just more wasted time. Now, the interesting thing for me, it turns out that these pros and cons essentially cancel each other out. And when you hunt with dogs, you average about 1 kilogram of meat for every hour that you're out there. And that is the exact same rate that you get when you're hunting without dogs and only rifles. So the same return rates for guns or just dogs. And that in itself is a pretty profound result. Anthropologists have done these sorts of technological comparisons all over South and Central America, comparing guns to conventional and traditional technologies like bows and blowguns. And every single time, modern firearms provide superior return rates to those conventional, traditional technologies. But here, in this setting, in Nicaragua, a man with just a good dog and a machete can go out and get the exact same amount of meat as somebody who's invested in modern firearms. For an anthropologist, that is a pretty profound result. Now, I've emphasized the encounter rates and the benefits of dogs in terms of increasing the encounter rates with certain key species. But that's not the advantage of hunting with dogs in other places. Here in the Kalahari, for example, dogs don't find the animals. They conform more so to my prior conception that they would stay by the hunter's side. And that's what they do here. In southern Africa, they stay by the hunter's side until the hunter has found the animal. And at that point, he'll release the dogs to chase after it. The dogs bring it to bay. Instead of running away from the hunter, the gemsbok, in this case, it's a gemsbok, will turn and face the dogs. And that's what allows the hunter to catch up and to throw his spear. In this case, it's not anything about finding the animals, it's making them easier to hunt. And I think this is an important reminder that the usefulness of dogs is going to vary from place to place. And we need to think about that when we're trying to figure out what hunting was like in Japan or Europe several thousand years ago. Now, the species that are most vulnerable to dogs in Nicaragua have a few things in common. For one thing, they seek refuge when they're pursued, which makes it possible for the human hunters to catch up and pursue. Second, these 4 animals, the ones that you see here, do well around the farmers' fields. They actually help themselves sometimes, much to the chagrin of the local people. Oh, those peccaries, they've been eating my manioc again. Right? And finally, they all reproduce quickly. Now, in general, the species that are most vulnerable to overhunting, I know we're all animal lovers here, and we don't want any of these animals to go extinct, right? And the ones that are most vulnerable are the ones with low reproductive rates, which can be indexed with a measure we call Rmax, the intrinsic rate of natural increase. It's defined as the difference of births minus deaths per year in optimal conditions, which basically means that there's no extrinsic mortality from predators. It's a hypothetical world. And Rmax varies a lot among hunted animals here in Nicaragua. For example, you see the spider monkey on the left of the slide. That Rmax of 0.1 tells us that for every 10 surviving spider monkeys, you're expecting 1 more to be born that year in the population. By contrast, for every 10 surviving agoutis, you're expecting 11 more to be born. So when you see this profound difference in reproductive rates, I mean, that's an indication that the agouti population can withstand much greater offtakes than what you see among primates. And so I took those data and I plotted that variable, the intrinsic rate of natural increase, on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we've plotted how many of the animals that are harvested within a species are captured with the assistance of dogs. So as you get farther on the y-axis, you go higher. You know, those are the species that are really associated with the use of dogs. And so there's those 4 that I highlighted earlier, right? And so this tells us that the species that are most vulnerable to hunters with dogs are the ones that are really not going to be overhunted anytime soon, that they can withstand that kind of pressure. By contrast, if you look down here, these are 3 primate species. Dogs are not useful for hunting primates. They're up in the trees, safely away from the dogs. And so, given the emphasis of using dogs, remember so much of the hunting is with dogs, I don't think it's a coincidence that the populations of spider monkeys and capuchin monkeys and howler monkeys are among the largest and least threatened populations of primates in Central and South America. I guess the moral of the story is that if you like primates, and if you can't stop people from hunting altogether, then sending hunters out with dogs, as opposed to guns, is a good thing for conservation. So from a hunter's perspective, it's kind of nice, right? You don't have to stray too far from home. When you're hunting with dogs, these animals are kind of coming to you, right? The pacas, the agoutis, they're happy to live near your fields. And so you walk a couple of miles from your home, go out in a nearby patch of forest, hopefully harvest an animal, grab some bananas on the way home, be economical with your time. But there's another reason that hunters don't like taking their dogs deep into the forest. Along with a team of veterinarians, I am documenting the demography of the dog population in the reserve. And it turns out that among the leading causes of death for adult dogs are attacks by jaguars and snake bites. The best hunting dog I ever saw in the reserve was killed by a jaguar. And this snake species, the furtilance, has claimed the lives of many others. I was actually out with a hunter one day when he lost his dog. The dog had been circling around a little bit, barking, preliminarily thinking that there was maybe something to be pursued. And then the dog started barking very excitedly, and a paca ran right across our path, the dog not far behind. Woof, 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 woof. And then suddenly, 30 seconds later, the dog was out of sight. It just stopped barking. We didn't hear anything. The jaguar moved that fast. And it's not just jaguars. There's other things out there that are dangerous. I was following another hunter one day. His dog had corralled a collared peccary in a hollow trunk, a big hollow trunk. And before we could get there, before the hunter was able to push the dogs aside and plug up the exits, the dog tried to go in the trunk too. And these are very sharp canine teeth you see here. And the collared peccary bit down on the dog's neck. Fortunately, it survived. It just missed the aorta. We couldn't tell at first. It was kind of a bloody mess, but the dog survived. But it's It's a tough world out there in the forest for a little domestic dog. Now, even if dogs manage to avoid the dangerous animals in the forest, they can suffer other injuries, just accidental injuries in some cases, like the machete wound that this dog suffered. The hunter was trying to pursue an animal, and it was not trained, remember, and it was just nosed in, got a little too close. The hunter didn't see it, and yeah, these dogs are not trained to stand back, and so accidents like this are fairly common. Now, in addition to injuries, these dogs get sick. Except for government teams that periodically circulate through the reserve, immunizing the dogs against rabies, the dogs receive very little medical care. Unlike the dogs here in the United States, these dogs don't get shots for canine distemper virus or parvovirus or any number of other pathogens that can undermine their health. They suffer from mange and ticks and other parasites. Now, we are working to document the health of these dogs, taking samples, blood samples, etc. And frankly, the situation is pretty bleak for a lot of these dogs. A lot of dogs look like this: malnourished, highly vulnerable to infectious diseases. Between the jaguars and the snakes and the accidents and the illnesses, we are finding that about half of the dogs in the population die every year. And so if you plot the distribution of ages, it looks like this. It's rare for a dog to live to the age of 5 or 6. And the life expectancy at birth is lower than that. From a hunter's perspective, that's something that you need to think about, right? If you invest in a hunting dog, you can lose that investment almost any time. You know, dogs don't really come into their own as hunters. They don't really become useful until maybe a year and a half, 2 years old. And so the window of time when, as a hunter, you get to use a talented hunting dog is actually pretty short. Gosh, if you get 3 good years out of a hunting dog when it's actively pursuing animals for you, that's pretty good. It's really rare to have a dog that lives to 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. And I think that's something that we need to think about. Earlier, I posed to you the question of guns versus dogs. Which do you choose if you're a Mayungna hunter? And we looked at return rates, and they were identical. But there's more to it than that, right? If we look at longevity, you know, a gun doesn't die after a couple of years. You're not going to suddenly lose the source of your hunting livelihood. You know, that's a point in favor of the rifles. You remember that story I told just now about the man who lost his dog to a jaguar? He had been harvesting 2 or 3 animals per week. And then suddenly, nothing. You know, that was okay in this place, in Nicaragua, because there are alternative sources of food. There's cultivated crops, and there's fishing. But gosh, if there were a society that really depended on a steady supply of meat, that couldn't do without it, that's a real challenge if you're relying on dogs, given the mortality that we see of dogs in these settings, in these populations. Now, in terms of acquiring one or the other, you know, this is a tricky thing. Guns are expensive. The typical household in the reserve manages to earn about $300 American per year, mostly by selling some items and goods to merchants that travel through the reserve. And that's not enough for most families to be able to afford a rifle. Only about 1/4 of the households that I've sampled are able to have a rifle. But a new puppy can be purchased for only about $4. And that's manageable. And with every purchase, there's a hope, of course, that dog will grow up to be a skilled hunter someday. But on the other hand, you have a rifle, you can put it in the corner for a few weeks, forget about it. You're busy with other things. It doesn't cost you anything. But a dog has to be fed. And that brings me back to an earlier question that I haven't answered yet. Are these dogs earning their keep? To answer that question, I found this website from the Ohio State University Vet School. I'm sure you can find comparable websites. But it basically tells you, based on the activity level of your dog and how big it is, how many calories it's going to need every day. Now, I had weighed the dogs out in the reserve, and the average dog weighs about 25 pounds, 10 or 11 kilograms, 12 kilograms. And given their level of activity, I estimate that they need approximately 874 calories per day. Now, the average adult dog helps to produce 613 calories per day as a hunting companion. So no, on average, it does not appear that these dogs are producing more than they consume. And that's before factoring in the deficits that they accumulate as puppies, before they even start hunting, right? Now, in that case, I've been talking about the average dog. And of course, there's some dogs that produce more than average. It turns out that the distribution of hunting success is highly skewed. A few dogs here are highly productive, but most dogs are below the threshold of producing more than they consume. On this histogram, that big spike of half a kilogram of meat per day or less, that's the threshold that we're looking at. Really, it's only these dogs to the right side of that threshold, including this dog, the most productive dog at my study site, that are producing more than they consume. And I really want to emphasize this point. In this place, in Nicaragua, where dogs are apparently more important to hunting success than just about anywhere else in the world, only a very small minority of these dogs are actually producing more than they consume. The vast majority are not earning their keep. And so, as an anthropologist, I have my doubts. I'm trained to think in terms of adaptive logic. I think, of course, these dogs must be earning their keep, but when you run the numbers, that doesn't seem to be the case. And that leaves me doubtful that any society is making an adaptive decision by keeping dogs for hunting, whether now or in prehistory. I'm no longer sure that dogs are adaptive from an economic perspective. So I started this presentation by asking, why dogs? And as I've said, anthropologists like me are trained to focus on costs and benefits, very material things, right? Not on the emotional connection of dogs and their owners, right? Not on the joy that we feel, when we take our dog outside and play with it. But now, maybe some of you have seen this recent report, this recent research report coming out of Japan, where researchers have looked at oxytocin, a hormone that's associated with bonding. Right? And it turns out that when owners stare deeply into their dog's eyes, they exhibit an uptick of oxytocin. There's a release of hormones that's comparable to the ways they feel and the hormones that they exhibit when they're looking into their children's eyes. There's something about the way that we bond with our dogs, and maybe it's time for anthropologists like me to factor that into our equations. Honestly, when I'm at my field site, it doesn't look like the Mayangna and the Mosquito love their dogs. Oh, they cuddle them a little bit as puppies, when they're really cute. But once a dog has reached adulthood, there's no petting, right? There's none of the interactions that characterize, what we see at the local dog park here in the United States. On the other hand, I've seen owners beat their dogs for misbehavior, just grabbing a belt or whacking at their dogs in frustration on a hunting trip with the side of their machete. And then little things, like, here in the United States, when you can take your hand and you kind of hold it out for the dog to sniff, it's a way of making friends, right? I try that in Nicaragua, and the dogs, they don't know what to do with it. They're just confused, and they feel anxiety, and they yelp, and they snap at me, right? It doesn't look like these dogs are used to receiving much affection or friendship. But that's through my cultural lens, right? That's from me growing up here in the United States, where we have a certain way of interacting with our dogs. On the other hand, I very vividly remember this dog. Its name was Tisnini. And he never amounted to much as a hunter. He was small and spent most of his time lounging around his owner's kitchen. And then one day, as a three-year-old, Tisnini stuck his nose into a tree trunk and was bit by a fer-de-lance, a fatal snake bite. And Tisnini's owner wept. This happy woman you see here in the boat simply wept for her dog. It seemed out of character at the time, but now I wonder. She apparently loved her dog. And maybe that's part of the answer to the question that I've posed in this presentation. Why dogs? I'd like to close by thanking some organizations that have made this research possible and a whole host of people who have been in the field with me and made my research quite a lot better and who have shared a lot of the pictures that you've seen in this presentation. Thank you.